another question regarding microaggressions. So a lot of times we talk about that, especially when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and we talk about microaggressions. And I would love specific examples because there are a lot of people who hear that term, learn what the term means, but they don't know the specifics of like what it is that
Sure.
people of color experience.
So I have an opinion about microaggressions that maybe most people don't have. I think that that is a term that should never be used. I think that any of these kinds of things that are insulting to us are not micro, they're macro, because micro implies, well, they're small, they're trivial, they don't have much impact. I am willing to bet that every person of color who has encountered a microaggression always remembers it. If it were micro, really micro, you wouldn't even remember it. You wouldn't think about it, oh, it happened. These are macroaggressions. And I want to give one example that hasn't to do with hair, but has to do with my mother. So my mother was born in 1923. She just died in January 2020. But she came up after the Depression from North Carolina and then the Great Migration. And she came up and eventually settled in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. My mother, I remember her telling me many stories about growing up, but I lived, and where she lived, it was a suburb just outside of Philadelphia called Ardmore. And in Ardmore, there's a Black community that was the service provider for the wealthy white community that lived in Ardmore. My mother told me about one instance where she went in Ardmore to buy a dress. And she walked into this little dress shop in Ardmore. And as she stepped up to go in the door, a white woman came to the door and before my mother could get in and said to my mother, "We don't have anything here in your size," just like that, and stood in the doorway. And my mother then was offended, of course, and walked away. My mother never forgot that. I mean, she wasn't slapped, she wasn't hit. She was just told by this white woman, basically, you're not welcome. So in the scheme of things in my mother's life, there were a lot of things that happened to her that were really more traumatic than that. But the point is, my mother never forgot that. Later in life, my mother was 70 something at some point where she would tell me, she again would bring up the story. I don't know what the subject was we were discussing, but the point is, she never forgot it. It was something that hurt her to the core, and yet she went on with her life. She didn't curl up in a ball and go in a corner. So what I maintain and what I believe is that anytime people of color experience these insults, the rudeness, the being brushed aside, being an attitude that you're not wanted in a particular space, there's nothing micro about it. These are macro aggressions. And I would love for us to stop, at least with respect to race, to not use that term, because none of this stuff that happens, and I'm sure I could point to anybody here who is attending this program, can remember many things that happened to them or to their parents that wasn't a major big deal in the scheme of the world, but was really important to them and hurtful to them. So I say to folks who have experienced these macroaggressions to don't trivialize them, those who've experienced them, and know that they are significant and they're important and should be talked about, and talked about in a way to educate the people who committed these aggressions.
All right, everyone, thank you for watching Asked and Answered. And if you like what you see, if you like this content, if you like all the series, please smash that like button, click subscribe.